When I share with anyone that I'm a composer, one of the first questions they ask is, what kind of music do you make? I'll usually respond by explaining that I make a lot of chamber music. I write solos, duets, other small ensemble instrumental music, often incorporating computer music in some capacity. Now you can understand that this response alone usually shuts down the question to begin with because it often satiates their curiosity, but it's also too far outside their experience of music to really follow up with any other meaningful questions. Sometimes I get the occasional, well, do you play jazz? You play in any bands? What I don't really share, because it doesn't get that far, is in my 16 years of being a professional composer, I've somehow avoided writing for any standard or typical ensemble you'd think of when it comes to music, or at least classical music or contemporary music or concert music. I've done things like marching band, I've done brass bands, but nothing like what you think of orchestra or even wind ensemble or string quartet. And most of us composers can be forgiven for not writing for those larger ensembles. Their scope and scale are usually too ambitious, especially for those of us that only moonlight as being a composer. It takes a lot of work to get big score of instruments, organize it, write something substantial, and then let alone try to get someone to perform it, try to get some ensemble, some orchestra to perform that piece. It's very difficult. But a quartet, a string quartet, or even a saxophone quartet, those should be easy, right? There are 4 people, there are lots of quartets out there, and you know what's even more absurd? I'm a trained saxophonist myself. I've played in saxophone quartets. So if there's anyone who would easily write a saxophone quartet, it should be the composer saxophonist like myself. But instead, I really chose to wait, I'd say. 10 years ago, I did try to write my first saxophone quartet, and it was a feeble attempt, and I was humbled. I was experienced and taught well through my bachelor's program at Murray State. I just returned from my first International Music Composition Festival, the High Score Festival in Pavia, Italy, which I'll link in the description. But what I brought back from that festival was little more than an imitation of the quartets that had inspired me and intimidated me. I don't really count that saxophone quartet I wrote 10 years ago among my serious work, both because it's incomplete and there were so many borrowed ideas in it. So to understand why it took me so long to write a string quartet or saxophone quartet in earnest, you have to understand the deep admiration I developed for the genre. And that story begins in August 2014 in Pavia. And if you're new here, welcome. I'm Jake Thiede. I am a composer based in Texas, and YouTube is kind of my sandbox. So if you like what I have to say, if you like the content, check out my channel, subscribe, like this video. I finally wrote a quartet. I finally wrote a string quartet or a saxophone quartet. I wanted to share the process of what it was like to compose for this for the first time. And you can actually buy the quartet on Amazon if you would like to support me. You can also download the sheet music on IMSLP. I've released it under Creative Commons, so you can download it for free. But I've actually bought the book. I've actually bought the physical version of the score, and I'm really proud of how it's turned out. Everything from the cream pages to incorporating this essay into there. I had a lot of fun publishing it and had a lot of fun formatting it. Got really nerdy with the details. So please, it's a love letter from me to everyone who might come across this video. Please check it out. I'll link it in the description below for Amazon. The composers at that High Score Festival that I was talking about were inspiring to me, a backwoods, naive American. There was representation at that festival in Italy from all the corners of the world, from Hong Kong all the way to upper Europe, and then in the United States to LA. So each of us was asked to compose a new work when we were selected. It was either for clarinet quartet, guitar quartet, or string quartet. I was assigned a clarinet quartet, and to me, and especially at that time, seemed very easy to do. I was in band world after all. I played saxophone and I participated in marching band, symphonic band. Not a single professional orchestra could be heard within an hour's radius of my hometown, so I had little to no exposure other than listening to the odd recording on a very nascent new YouTube. This was 2014. But first, this Bachelor of Music. For the first time as a Bachelor of Music, I had just finished my degree. I was exposed for the first time to DMAs and PhDs in music, so Doctor of Musical Arts or Doctor of Philosophy in music, one after another. Two composers really stood out to me. It was Tyler Kapp and Chris McCormick. Chris passed away in February 2020, right before the outbreak of the global pandemic. And I remember seeing the news on Facebook that he passed away likely to complications from his type 1 diabetes that he battled for 24 years. I think he was really only like in his mid-20s when he passed. He died tragically young, but I still remember him and his impact to me now, 10 years later, and I'll likely remember him for the rest of my life. Chris's piece blew my mind because of its beautiful incorporation of groove rhythms and the battle between a live string quartet that was in front of us performing and a pre-rendered MIDI quartet in the background. He asked for speakers and wanted a rendered MIDI sound to play against the real quartet. And again, it kind of dated itself, but it didn't. At the same time, it seems perfect because it was in an era when we had limited free sounds and free sound fonts, at least in the open source. And if you did want to buy like a really good package, it probably cost a lot of money to get like a quartet sound MIDI. So what we all heard was what we were familiar with when in terms of MIDI finale, Garriton. And I remember him wanting to make it the ultimate battle of man versus machine in a time when social media was exploding. We were in a pre-AI era, and just to have fun with technology and this idea of man versus machine. Tyler Kapp's string quartet captivated me because of its differentness and its application and incorporation of extended techniques. It was so tasteful. Often in contemporary music, most composers try new and experimental techniques with no true aim or goal, oftentimes because they're still trying to figure out how those techniques might sound for themselves. They're so new, they don't really understand what they sound like. The title of Tyler's piece was called Paramnesia, and like the title implies, it tries to meet a combination of paranoia and amnesia. The piece had hints of Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 8 with those similar knocking chords and rhythms, the dunk, 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 the gentle C major chord. And in Tyler's words, I think someone asked him, and I was listening, and in the conversation, he said, "I just want to write a perfectly voiced C major chord, but slowly devolving and turning into a crunch chord full of noise and chaos to conclude it." So Chris and Tyler, these two composers in 2014 alone, gave me so much newfound wonder and respect. I say wonder. These two composers alone gave me so much newfound wonder and respect for the genre that is string quartet. But maybe a little too much. It made me intimidated. How could I ever match up to these kinds of pieces? And later in my music school experience, I learned about more and more different kind of string quartets, starting with George Crumb's Black Angels, of course, to Steve Reich's Different Trains, Lochinmann's Grand Torso, Philip Glass's first movement of Glassworks and the last movement of Glassworks, the eventual exposure to the Jack String Quartet, and especially Ken Thompson's Thaw, which I'm going to talk about more in section 4. My own music peers and colleagues, like Sky McClay's Many Cadences and Sharp's Raw. All of these pieces, again, for the longest time, stopped me from ever thinking I could do a string quartet, because all of the intrusive thoughts would be, how can I ever do anything as good as that? Or where do I even begin to start? I could care less about the history or repertoire from anything pre-modern or pre-20th century. Not that it's bad, it just doesn't have any musical substantial impact on me. I've not taken more time than I need to study Haydn, Mozart, or Beethoven string quartets. I just don't find them that interesting. But contemporary string quartets, I'm not gonna lie, I'm still very much intimidated by that great body of work that contemporary musicians continue to make to this day for the string quartet. All this applies as well for the saxophone quartet, but it was that fundamental experience in High Score Festival in Pavia, Italy, that really set the foundation for the awe and wonder of what a composer can do with a string quartet. I've talked about this with one of my buddies, Corey Reeder, when we were in the middle of our doctorates. He wrote about the stereotypical weight composer professors. He wrote about the stereotypical weight that professors and colleagues put on the genre, totally unnecessarily because of the greats like Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms. He fleshed it out on his page, reflecting and writing on his first string quartet. Quote, these are Corey's words. Although there were numerous pieces and experiments from undergrad, this was the first piece that I felt confident about and that I felt actually had some merit. Still, it kept coming up again and again with my professors and with my friends that there's this weird pressure when writing a string quartet. I think this is a feeling that stems from a perception of the weight of great composers of the past and how they had established a precedent for the importance of the genre. Perhaps I was ignorant to history or still in my contrarian phase, but I never felt this pressure while writing this piece. Still, I think the idea itself is interesting and worth unpacking. Once my dissertation is published, I'll direct you toward a 100-page document that covers my thoughts on this, but the shorter version sounds something like, tradition is valuable, but don't let it be peer pressure. Tradition is valuable, but don't let it be peer pressure from dead people. I love string quartets. You don't need to feel obliged to carry a torch. Just write a cool piece. So today, in 2026, what's the difference for Jake Thiede in finally composing my first quartet? Why compose a string quartet, saxophone quartet 16 years into your composition career? Well, my life has changed substantially as a husband to Ari and a father of 3 beautiful, chaotic children. My time and resources are limited, and as far as I can tell, will become even more limited. So the reason I compose a string quartet now, well, it's now or never. And at the same time, it's the best time to compose one after many years of trial, error, and fun, discovering my own compositional voice. Altogether, I composed a string quartet and saxophone quartet in the space of a month, and it flowed so easily I can't even credit myself with how motivated I was to compose a 15-minute multi-movement work. It's all just been a wonderful gift from God and one of His many graces in my life. So the following is a breakdown of each movement, the musical influences and sources, and the people I think of when I still compose in these many styles. The analysis will be based on intuition, feeling, and other non-technical jargon. Because I'm not a music theorist, I'm far from it, and my own eyes glaze anytime I read any sort of technical analysis of music. So if you're still here, listening to this, backwoods composer, still here listening to this, thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I'm gonna stop there. The first movement's called The Rainbow Reminds Us. To me, it's funny how the many roots of this quartet find themselves back to Pavia in 2014. I submitted to the festival among many other call for scores via the composer's site, and more often than not, it was just casting your music into the void without any response or feedback, all digitally. But occasionally you'd receive life-changing news, and the high score email was one of those responses for me. I remember getting the email pretty vividly because I was a desk worker within our residential college system dorms. And one of my favorite and really only available shifts was either midnight to 4 a.m., 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., or midnight to 8 a.m., especially when it was on the break. I was working one of those shifts when I got the congratulations email that I was accepted into the 2014 cohort of the High Score Festival. Sleep deprived, yet full of adrenaline and dopamine, I shared the good news with my mom. And I remember her asking, "How are you going to pay for it?" And then my heart suddenly dropped. I was 21, had a little bit saved, but nothing extravagant. So I worked at odd jobs and in kitchens throughout college to help pay my way through this tuition and my college tuition. So I also tried a GoFundMe campaign, and I called it the Personal Prelude Project, and set out to compose a short prelude for every person that generously donated to my trip to Italy. The first of those preludes, Prelude 1, or Loop, is dedicated to Mariah Caven. She was the first person to donate. Mariah and I were both music education majors, and we spent many hours in the car together on the way to a middle school in the middle of Lyon County, Kentucky. We taught together and got through a strenuous 100 hours of practicum together, and on those many hours in the car, we bonded over our shared love of Philip Glass, his Glassworks, and his original score for The Truman Show. What better way to honor her donation by composing some sort of minimal work? At that time, it was a fun, short, experimental piece but it had so much of a larger impact on my compositional voice to this day. I knew it was something special when I composed it, but the process felt more like cheating than actual composition work. During my bachelor's studies, I assumed incorrectly that all composition had to be brain-frying work. If you weren't on the floor, stumped, hunched, convicted over a piano for hours on end, you weren't actually composing. And I really so wish I could go back and tell young Jake and shake him on his shoulders and say, this is it. This is how you compose. It's fun and it's like playing. It's a puzzle only you can solve. But I continued to stress, labor, and copy other people for another year until I found the music in my heart that I wanted to sing to the world. This newfound style probably has a more sophisticated or simple name, but I like to call it the musical sculpting technique. It's similar to the process of backward planning. Begin with the end in mind and work backward. In the case of Prelude 1, 2 measures were fully composed, and I began chiseling out 2 measures at a time. If I were a sculptor, then silence would be my marble block. Phrase by phrase, and new notes introduced as the whole thing's looped over and over again until the phrase is heard in its entirety. Steve Reich has a name for this style of composition, or at least like a bigger picture, a bigger, broader, all-encompassing name, and that's just music as a gradual process. It was a profound artistic statement for its time. Reich communicated the desire for a music's compositional process to be simultaneously performed and heard. Here's Reich's words. Performing and listening to music that is a perceptible, gradual process resembles turning over an hourglass and watching the sand slowly run through to the bottom, pulling a swing, releasing it, and observing it gradually come to rest. Placing your feet in the sand by the ocean's edge and watching, feeling, and listening to the waves gradually bury them. Though I may have the pleasure of discovering musical processes and composing the musical material to run through them, once the process is set up and loaded, it runs by itself. Much of Reich's pieces pioneered this type of music making through phases. In the same publication in which he wrote this essay, he published a proto-version of his famous piano phase. Other compositions he wrote were the Counterpoint series, where a performer pre-records him or herself on tape and performs a live solo over these loops. In both, the audience is privileged to hear the process of composition flow from beginning to end. Contrast this with most Western music from the past, Bach for example. Most compositions from the 17th century are not obvious as to how or why they're composed as such. I guess you could make an argument that counterpoint is a gradual process, but it's not immediately intuitive. Reich pioneered a more reflective listening in the same vein as John Cage and his peer Philip Glass. I like to think that Prelude 1 loop contributes to this gradual process genre, if it's a humble minor one. And with all this said, I wouldn't learn about music as a gradual process until the end of my doctoral studies 4 or 5 years later. And with all that said, I wouldn't learn about music as a gradual process until the end of my doctoral studies 4 or 5 years later. Doing 10 concurrent years of music school blurs the lines and has a way of making a musician a metaphorical time traveler. But it all comes together with the first movement of this quartet. The Rainbow Reminds Us is probably my favorite of the 4 movements for how much fun it was to compose. The chord progression is an inverse version of the final movement, which I'll cover later. I probably would be lying by omission if I didn't mention how influenced I was by Evan Williams' Quartet for saxophones. I got to learn and perform a couple movements from this piece my second year of my doctorate at UNT. Our quartet called ourselves the Image Quartet and probably was more informally known as Dr. Nessler's Graduate Quartet. But playing Williams' Quartet for saxophone, you understand that the piece has 7 movements and an arch form or mirror form. Here are Williams' words. The work is in an arch form, with the first movement related to the last, the second to the sixth, and so on. Yet, instead of each pair of movements sharing or providing variations on melodic material, they are images through a mirror darkly of each other. My own quartet has kind of an arch form, but it's really only the first and last related by a chord progression. Everything else is a little bit more hodgepodge and intuitive composing. I hope to elaborate more on this musical sculpting idea and compose more works within this style of gradual process. The title itself, The Rainbow Reminds Us, comes from a joint project with my buddies Carl Kempel and Andrew West. All of the movement titles from my quartet come from some inspiration of our podcast called Beholding Beauty. I wrote the cold opens, and each of the titles is either a direct quotation or a derivation of the topic, or even a direct quote from the Christian Bible. For this movement, it comes from the climax of a story I told for episode 3. How do we know God loves us? This is surely a difficult question for anyone to ask in our suffering world. One timeless reminder is the rainbow. With all its splendor, vibrancy, and mystery, the rainbow reminds us of God's unconditional love to us. And how is a rainbow made? By the refracting of sunlight through rain droplets. Despite our suffering, the evil in the world, despite the evil all of us commit and meditate on, God has promised to be merciful, patient, and slow to anger. The word rainbow in its original Hebrew context meant my bow. Genesis 9:13 says, I have set my bow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Today, our culture has perverted the rainbow's meaning to say that it actually means pride or a spectrum of sexuality, but God shows us that it's Him hanging up His weapon of war as an unconditional act of love and mercy toward mankind. The rainbow, both beautiful and powerful. Even if you go your entire life without seeing one, the symbolism is unparalleled. Our God made a weapon of war into a sign of love for mankind. This is my remembrance and reminder of the rainbow, without trying to be provocational to anyone who would think the rainbow means anything else in any other context. Ultimately means God loves us. I think seeing a rainbow triggers something ancient in me, something deep in my bones reminds me that God loves me. Movement 2 is called When We Sing Together. Experiencing the global pandemic of 2020 firsthand, it's difficult to say what the height of such a moment might be. Was it during the summer, where we were all more or less locked in our apartments and houses, scorned for going to the beach? Or was it when the days grew darker and winter was knocking on our door? For me, it was when the reality of working full-time in a non-musical vocation hit me the hardest. I was composing a piece called Sorry I Could Not Travel Both, in this in-between of being a full-time student and also a full-time warehouse worker. As the summer days were waning and the days grew darker, I was working at Amazon each day between 7:30 a.m. and 6 p.m. every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. What was most difficult was that I rarely got any sunlight those days, being in the warehouse all day. But in between the 10-hour shifts, I got to compose for friends both far and wide. One of my friends, whom I had only really met once at the Bowling Green State University Graduate Symposium, Nathan Smith was his name. He wanted a piece for guitar and cello. I think it was the fact that I was starved for compositional work that the music really flowed out of me at that time. Looking back on it now, I didn't realize how far down the belly of the beast I was at Amazon. Over the course of a couple days, I composed a 4-minute work for him. What inspired this work was from a concert in 2016. Todd Reynolds performed a violin solo titled Killer, composed by David Lang during my master's program. I think, if anything else in my master's degree, seeing Todd Reynolds teach and perform changed how I understand and approach music more than anything else. Because I was a graduate assistant at UNCG, I essentially was a chauffeur for most of our guest artists. Todd was different in a lot of wonderful ways. Between picking him up from the airport, going through Guitar Center for the odd 90-degree angle, unbalanced quarter-inch cable, and dropping him off at his hotel, he gave me insights into what it was like to rub elbows with people in the scenes, for lack of better words. At that time, it was incredibly obvious that Todd was a New Yorker and I was a backwoods Kentucky-ite. But what I didn't really realize was, at that time, was how humble and down-to-earth he was. And he came to critique us simple students in North Carolina constructively and positively. To me, it's that sort of humility that actually reflects whether a person loves their craft and teaching it to anyone and everyone. Killer, the piece, stood out to me because of the odd incorporation of a kick drum. I remember assisting him with this concert, setting up speakers, multiple interfaces, equipment, and this random kick drum. It was a piece that made me jealous of all violin players that I could probably never perform the piece on saxophone. The combination of the foot on kick drum, the hands on violin, and the rhythmic complexity between the playback electronics and the actual violin itself threw me for a loop. At that time, I was told fixed media, aka a track that you play on loudspeakers while you play music live on your instrument, is just classical music karaoke. Above that, in value and respect, was interactive electronics, or music for live computer music with feedback, effects, or manipulation. Somehow, David Lang made you forget about all those technicalities of fixed media versus interactive electronics, because you were just trying to figure out, what was a violin player trying to play? It sounded both precise and improvisatory at the same time, and I wanted to try to adapt this in my own style and voice. Sorry I Could Not Travel Both was the result. What some might call polyrhythms, I might call more improvisatory rhythms. Polyrhythms usually are clear in their attempt at showing themselves as a backdrop against another rhythm, i.e. 7 against 4, 3 against 2, 7 against 11. But improvisatory rhythms imply a constant stochastic, I've learned that word recently and I like using it everywhere, stochastic change between polyrhythms under a consistent rhythmic motif. For Sorry I Could Not Travel Both, the rhythmic motif was a simple arpeggio and cello voicings, 3 notes of a chord spaced out in a 5th and 10th from the root. Maybe a picture for illustration? The improvisatory rhythm alternates between 3, 4, 5, and 6, which creates a speeding up, slowing down effect that feels jarring yet grooves. In the second movement of the quartet, the players go through a sort of fantasia mixed with theme and variations. The first 21 measures function as an introduction to the material being explored and varied. After that, the different variations are an exploration of different improvisatory rhythms. The title, When We Sing Together, is taken again from a cold open I wrote for our podcast. Quote, "If we can sing together, we know this increases oxytocin and can increase the positive effects of bonding and community." In their 2013 article, a team of researchers led by Björk Vikhoff found that, Group singing has physical benefits, like increasing heart rate variability, as timed breathing as part of singing slows us down. Group singing also increases the release of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and allows communities to grow together physically, emotionally, and potentially spiritually." End quote. I attempted to represent the title musically by showing how from beginning to end, the quartet's becoming more and more aligned as the space between chords grows longer and longer. Regardless, each member has an equally important part to play, and when in perfect unison rhythmically, can reflect the beauty music has for us when we sing together. Part 3. Third movement's called For We Are the Aroma of Christ. During the 2013-2014 school year at Murray State, I was approached by one of my old high school friends, Solar Ardabelli, to see if I could make music for a film he was working on. It was going to be called Lazy and had feature film ambitions. At that time, I was deeply immersed in indie romantic movies. My favorite was a film from 2011 called Like Crazy. It had Felicity Jones before her breakout role in Star Wars and the late Anton Yelchin. The story, the acting, the filmography, and the soundtrack altogether had a profound impact on me. All these elements coming together was just as compelling and impactful, if not more, than any Mahler symphony I'd listened to. I set out to emulate this music that I loved and wrote a piece called Memories of a Lost Love. Sorry, it's actually called Memories of a Love Lost. Not that it matters. The piece is primarily a minimalist exploration of how sound can be manipulated on an upright piano. I initially wrote the piece during my sophomore year of college and have a distinct memory of sending it to my friend Clint Baumgartner. He was my de facto indie music expert. I think he just sent me a text to the effect of, "Sounds good, man." I've unfortunately lost the full original, but a sample still hangs on by a thread on SoundCloud if you want to take a listen. Memories of a Love Lost was my first foray into unashamedly composing simple music. I remember bringing into my composition lesson that piece and my professor trying to be supportive but relatively unimpressed. We discussed the harmonic aspects of the music, where it modulates the structure, but I think he could clearly see it was an experiment, and I didn't really know where I was taking it. Looking back, I kind of wish he asked me more questions about the influences and maybe given me more resources on what I could copy, or not copy, but be influenced by and learn from and be informed by. Regardless, a decade later, I'm so grateful and humbled by this piece of music because it taught me more than many of my composition lessons ever could. To try new things, to play, and to be unashamed of both repetition and simplicity. If Like Crazy and composing for our film Lazy was a match to start a fire, the fuel was my study of Philip Glass's works. I, like most nascent music majors, discovered his music like Glass works and his string quartets through YouTube. It was his music in tandem with John Cage that taught me to love music experientially. That is, to not only enjoy music's emotional capacity, but its physical and temporal qualities as well. Being a post-Christian Midwestern man, my musical vernacular was Reliant K, pop Christian rock. Some tracks might be 3 minutes long, others noticeably longer. When your understanding of form, phrasing, and harmony is informed by your favorite rock group, there's only so much you can do for your own music. As they say, you don't know what you don't know. In a way, for We Are the Aroma of Christ, this third movement points back to this moment in my life. Instead of trying to show off my composition prowess, this movement downplays it. I loved composing this movement because it was an opportunity to humbly reflect on what I love about music and also to share that with everyone that might lend an ear. Part 4 and conclusion. Movement 4, the last movement, is called Hope on the Breeze. This movement was directly inspired by the piece Thaw by Ken Thompson. I remember hearing the opening chords, double stops paired with an instruction to play sans vibrato, and my view of the string quartet forever changed. It was 2017 thereabout, and until that moment, my main allure to the string quartet was to use techniques like sol ponticello and sol tasto. For those unfamiliar with those overly fancy Italian words, sol ponticello for strings like violin, cello, bass means literally on the bridge. So you're playing on the bridge, playing the string on the bridge, and it results in a sort of glassy metallic sound full of random sounding chirps and high overtones, kind of like a distorted guitar for my metal friends. Sol tasto is somewhat the opposite meaning. On the fingerboard is what it means, and it results in a muted, dark sound. Some composers and orchestrators, technicians say that it sounds like a flute, yields a flute sound, flautando, maybe, I don't know. But I gotta respectfully disagree. I guess if you listen deeply, sure, but to me, it's a technique used more when you want a dark, muted, softer sound, especially on the guitar. These captivated my attention. They were totally unique and awesome sounding techniques for strings that I heard in piece after piece for string quartet that I wanted to incorporate myself. But ironically, my own string quartet, saxophone quartet, doesn't include any sol ponticello and maybe a little bit of sol tasto. But a technique that I think is even more unique and beautiful and awesome for its sound qualities and uniqueness is senza vibrato. And I have Thaw to thank for that. Ironically, when I look back at the score that I bought, there's no indication by Ken Thompson to play senza vibrato, but rather just warm. If you listen to the piece, you can hear no undulation or wavering of tone. I was first introduced to the quartet performing this recording, Jack Quartet, in 2015, previously. They were the ensemble in residence for the New Music on the Point festival hosted in Vermont. One of their masterclasses was on temperament and intonation. In the new music world, the Jack Quartet is one of the top performers of new music and considered the foremost in experimental works, especially as their specialty. On top of extended techniques as well as complex rhythms, intonation and harmony was one of the many areas they needed to master in order to perform this kind of music they wanted to be renowned for. To my 22-year-old brain, this new composer getting all excited and studying this for the first time, I couldn't begin to fathom how to even compose something so good, let alone understand just intonation versus equal temperament for the string quartet. Hearing them perform was a totally different experience. The different lush harmonies and unique timbres from microtonal compositions continued to blow my mind at that festival. So a couple years later into my doctorate, hearing Thaw informed all of this technique. I loved how these opening chords, so simple, so colorful, made the quartet no longer sound like strings, but something more like an accordion or even electronic. Occasionally, or consciously or subconsciously, ever since Warm or Senza Vibrato, consciously or subconsciously, ever since I heard this warm Senza Vibrato sound, I've always wanted to incorporate it in my own way. Hope on the Breeze was such an opportunity. It was the first movement that started the quartet, even though it's the last, and gave me the hope, motivation, and inspiration to write more. Speaking of hope, it's been an idea I've meditated on often in between walking from the parking garage to my office. Hope and lack thereof is something that's been brought front of mind just by listening to The Ramsey Show. Dave Ramsey often diagnoses a lack of hope in many of his listeners. When he helps them with their financial situation, he digs deep to the caller's motivations and desires. His call to action is rarely technically financial, though every now and again he'll recommend to sell something or buy something to fix their problem. But rather, he's always looking deeper into the spiritual or emotional or behavioral problems. When a caller clearly expresses feelings of despair, feeling trapped or stuck, Ramsey's call to action is a change in motivation and hope. The verse he constantly points to is Proverbs 13:12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. So, bigger picture, I, Jacob Thiede, worked 10 years in academia toward a terminal degree that doesn't satisfy my inner longings. For the longest time, being able to say I have a doctorate, even a PhD, was my hope. But here on the other side of the looking glass, the grass is not greener. I don't even use the degree in any professional sense. I'm a financial advisor now. So over the last couple years since finishing music school, I'm still philosophizing, putting together a complex puzzle to understand how God has designed my life right now. And with that, I find myself asking constantly, what or who am I putting my hope in? These days, my hope is often connected in what I can do in myself and how many videos I can crank out on YouTube. Case in point. But just asking that question recenters my heart and soul on reminding myself who I am, a follower of Christ. Being a Christian for most of my life, it's a mantra I'm honestly sick of and tired of. But as they say, only the devil is in a hurry. An anchor is not sexy. It needs to be the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And similarly, this is my faith and identity right now, and hopefully always. It's often when I lose sight of who I am that I am most distraught, anxious, and lost. But to be tethered and connected to a God who loves me is what I've uncovered to be true despite all the change in my heart, mind, soul, and body over these short years and in this world around us. Hope on the Breeze, this fourth movement, ties this philosophizing in my heart in musical form. It expresses the beauty of hoping in the Lord. While Ari, my wife, was pregnant with our twins, our first kids, I met with a mentor at church named Milt. He's a 70-something retired doctor and has seen a thing or two. His first kids were twins as well, so he was eager to mentor me as a young man and dad-to-be. He pushed me to do consistent disciplines with Jesus: journaling, prayer, and Bible memory. I have him to thank for these long-winded essays as my form of journaling. And for my Bible memory, the first verse we memorized together is Psalm 27:4. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. This verse aimed my hope toward that beauty of the Lord, to be with him all the days of my life and see him out in his temple. Whenever I feel most hopeless, this is one of my go-to verses to anchor me back to Jesus. Composing Hope on the Breeze was like composing for film. The form was through composed and meant to satisfy the pacing and duration of the cold open I narrated over our third episode of Beholding Beauty. Musically, it's a controlled and deliberate step back, again, to a simple ascending chord progression I could listen to over and over again. Part of me wanted to write something a little bit more complex, some polyrhythms or mixed meter, but that'd be missing the point. Hope on the Breeze is dedicated to my wife, my kids, my family, and friends who know nothing about music but much of beauty. It was a proud statement of who I've become. I've written complex works before and probably will write even more complex music later, but now I want to share the simple music that's shaped who I've become. It's the music I love and want to share with others. Conclusion. So that's the best I got for myself at age 34 and 2026 with not enough time on my hands. Maybe I'll look back and scoff at all of this as vanity and navel gazing, but hopefully most of this, maybe all of it, will still remain true and I can still be proud of what I've done. Most of my composition teachers cautioned us composers to use our words, or at least not to lean too heavily on them, but I'm grateful for the teachers that helped me hone my writing. This quartet was so much fun and inspiration to write, and I wanted to share its many inspirations and the people who are so essential to its creation. To everyone who's made an impact in my life, this music is a tribute to you. Thanks for watching.